Hello, let's speak today about Ukrainian politics. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, political transformations in Ukraine have taken a pendulum course. There have been periods of intense democratization, such as in the early 90s or during Yushchenko's presidency. These phases were followed by democratic backsliding, notably during the presidencies of Kuchma and Yanukovych. However, unlike some neighboring post-Soviet countries, these setbacks didn't lead to the establishment of a consolidated authoritarian regime. Instead, they were followed by new phases of liberalization and democratization. Thus, post-Soviet democracy building in Ukraine can be described by the phrase 2 steps forward, 1 step back. At the same time, within a relatively short period of time, two revolutions occurred in Ukraine, each playing a crucial role in steering the country on the democratic path during political crisis. The young Ukrainian democracy is marked by the instability of its political institutions. In the 30 years since independence, the form of governance in Ukraine has undergone 5 principal changes. It started as a presidential system, then transitioned to a presidential parliamentary model, followed by a shift to parliamentary presidential system, then by a return to a presidential parliamentary, and once again to a parliamentary presidential system. The voting system undergoes significant changes in almost every election in Ukraine. The country has experimented with various types of majority voting, proportional representation, and mixed voting systems. Finally, Ukraine has settled an open list proportional voting, although it has yet to be implemented in practice in parliamentary elections. The instability of the electoral system doesn't contribute to the structuring of the party system. The last one is fragmented, and elections often lead to radical shifts in political landscape. Political parties in Ukraine function rather like short-term electoral projects than cohesive teams of like-minded citizens. They tend to have relatively short life cycles, and it's noteworthy that not a single Ukrainian party has been represented in all parliaments. The political regime in Ukraine is commonly described as transitional or hybrid, combining features of democratic and authoritarian governance. This is exactly how Freedom House has qualified it for many years in its annual Nations in Transit rating, while in the Global Freedom Index, Ukraine is rated as partially free. These assessments indicate that the process of democratic consolidation in the country are still ongoing, and the risk of regression from democracy remains high. Some scholars like Fisun or Matsievsky qualify political regime in Ukraine and Ukrainian politics in general as neo-patrimonial. Basically, neo-patrimonialism is the key concept for understanding the political history of modern Ukraine. Deriving from Max Weber's patrimonialism, who used this term to describe a system where authority is based on family ties, patron-client networks, and personal loyalty, alongside the existence of formal rules and regulations, neo-patrimonialism is considered a modern form of the traditional patrimonial rule, blending the elements of the patrimonial and rational bureaucratic governance. This type of governance was formed in Ukraine in the mid-90s. On the one hand, the newly adopted constitution established a strong president's model, which under Leonid Kuchma's rule began gradually concentrating authority. On the other hand, at this point, the main Ukrainian financial and industrial groups holding solid influence and resources had been established. Thus, the clan oligarchic model of political class organization arose. In practice, this worked as follows. Since rule of law mechanisms were dysfunctional, big business entities needed the state's loyalty and support to be effective. To gain this loyalty and support, they required direct influence over decision-making. To this end, they started bribing officials, facilitating appointment of loyal public servants and judges, investing in political parties and media to promote their agendas. As a result, oligarchic clans emerged and took control of political power and vital social resources, while political competition became primarily determined by the struggle between these clans. In general, the Ukrainian patrimonial regime is characterized by the following main features. First of all, it's personalized power, which means authority tends to be concentrated in the hands of a single leader or a small circle of individuals, rather than being distributed across institutions. The second feature is extensive presidential powers. Though Ukraine is a parliamentary presidential republic, in practice the president has much more authority than assigned by the legislation. Informal relations and networks. Decision-making often rely on informal networks or of personal relationship rather than formal institutions and procedures. Clientelism. The political elites maintain power by distributing benefits and resources to loyal supporters, fostering a system of patron-client relationship. Corruption is widespread and embedded within the political and economic systems, with elites often using public office for private gain. Weak rule of law. Legal framework are often undermined by selective enforcement and manipulation by those in power, leading to a lack of accountability and transparency. And finally, the last feature is limited political competition. Opposition may face obstacles such as restrictions on media freedom, limiting the competitiveness of elections, etc. These features collectively contribute to the persistence of neopaternalism in Ukrainian political system, shaping its governance dynamics and affecting its democratic development. The Revolution of Dignity and Russian aggression towards Ukraine launched tectonic processes in Ukrainian politics that will have continuing consequences. In this context, the following important aspects should be noted. First of all, democratization. 2 cycles of democratic elections were held, and in all cases, peaceful transfer of power was ensured through legally established democratic procedures. For the first time since 1994, this happened without shocks, which is one of the most important signs of democratic consolidation. Many new tools for government transparency and accountability, as well as for better civic engagement, have been introduced, like open data solutions, electronic declarations of officials, Prozoro system for public procurement, competitive procedures for appointments, and such tools of civic engagement like e-petitions, e-consultations, participatory budgeting. Over the last 10 years, governance in Ukraine has certainly become more open and accountable to the people. Social support for the democratic governance model and perception of the Ukrainian political system as democratic have increased. In 2023, around 60% of Ukrainians expressed support for democracy as the most preferred governance model and perceived Ukraine as a democratic or at least partly democratic country. The second track was decentralization. Before the Revolution of Dignity, Ukraine was a rather centralized state with a strong hierarchy of public authorities and little autonomy for local government bodies. This system was extremely ineffective in distributing funds and organizing public service provision, and was prone to authoritarian tendencies. That's why after the revolution, the public demand for decentralization increased significantly, and the corresponding political prerequisites emerged. During 2014-2020, a large-scale administrative reform was implemented. As a result, instead of 11,000 small municipalities, there were established 1,469 amalgamated municipal units. And instead of previously existing almost 500 districts, new 136 consolidated districts were created. In parallel, fiscal and budgetary decentralization have been realized, allowing the strengthening of the powers and autonomy of local government and giving them more authority and responsibility for local affairs. Thus, having retained the unitary structure, Ukraine has become a much more decentralized state, and this has been the key trend of its recent political development. However, the reform was not completed, and due to the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russia, many decentralization processes were curtailed. In some cases, there were even some steps back were taken to the recentralization of power. This poses significant risks to the previous achievements of the reform, which was rightly considered one of the most successful. The third track is Europeanization. The UUA Association Agreement was signed in 2014, and further implementation has largely impacted Ukraine's internal political development. Many sectoral reforms initiated and implemented during this period were related to the agreement and Ukraine's European integration obligations. Among them, establishment of new anti-corruption environment. Also, what was important that EU essentially substituted Russia and other post-Soviet states in Ukraine export and import and became its leading trade partner with a share of more than 40% in 2020. Ukraine has joined many EU programs and benefited from them, like, for instance, Horizon, Creative Europe, COSME, and many other sectoral projects. In 2022, Ukraine has also joined the European energy market, which became very important for its energy security during the full-scale invasion. One more important thing which happened, it was that in 2017, short-term visas for Ukrainian citizens were cancelled in the EU, resulting in much more intensive interpersonal contacts. The level of social support for European integration crossed the 50% mark and continued growing. In public opinion polls of 2023, about 80% of Ukrainians reported support for the EU integration, which has never been observed previously. One more track, a very important track of Ukraine's development after the Revolution of Dignity, was digitalization. At the time of revolution, Ukraine lagged many other countries in terms of digitalization. Despite the dynamic development of the Ukrainian IT sector, numerous territories lacked access to high-speed internet, including mobile ones. Additionally, digital solutions were minimally utilized in the provision of public services. The situation has changed rapidly since 2014. An appropriate government agency was created, and in 2019 it was transformed into a Ministry of Digital Transformation. Relevant public policies were adopted, high-speed mobile internet networks were launched, and a fundamental new architecture of electronic tools and resources was developed, including state registries and their interoperability, open data solutions, ADAM solutions, DIA application, etc. The next track of post-revolutionary Ukrainian development was intensive institutionalization of civil society. Ukrainians traditionally mistrust the authorities and trust more people and social institutions. Herewith, they tend to establish and maintain strong horizontal ties, primarily with people from their close, albeit often broad circles. Despite the still significant spread of paternalism, a critical part of Ukrainians is proactive. Under challenging circumstances, they act instead of waiting for help. This proactivity is the main reason why Ukraine has a dynamic civil society with a high capacity for social mobilization during crisis. The Revolution of Dignity and the following Russian invasion gave rise to unprecedented social self-organization, grassroots activism, and volunteer movement. Many new NGOs, volunteer initiatives, and grassroots communities arose covering new areas of activity, like supporting the army, veterans, internally displaced persons, many new think tanks emerged, and as well as local community organizations. Basically, civil society became the main driver of reforms after the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. This also resulted in the increased public trust in volunteer initiatives and NGOs. In 2021, 74% of citizens reported that they trust volunteers supporting the army, while 66% trusted initiatives helping EDPs and 39% trusted civic organizations. In 2023, the level of trust increased even more. Over 80% of respondents trusted the volunteers and over 50% the civic organizations. If talking about remaining problems and challenges which arise on the path of Ukraine's democratic development, one should note, first of all, the slow progress of reforms after the Revolution of Dignity, not meeting social expectations. And this factor became the key factor leading to shifts in the political orientations and the landscape in 2019. 2019, when Zelensky and his newly established party won the elections and took full power. However, these new forces also failed to ensure the speed and depth of transformation the society expected from them. For instance, there is still a very high level of corruption serving one of the pillars for patrimonial governance. In 2021, Ukraine took 122 place in the world according to the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, compared to 144 in 2012. And only in 2023, Ukraine was rated 104, which so far was the best position in its history. Despite all the transformations during the last 10 years, the state and politics in Ukraine remain neo-patrimonial. Under Zelensky's presidency, this characteristic has only intensified, and his personal power and the power of his office have only increased. In the context of war, some recentralization processes have started which could further entrench the existing neo-patrimonial model. In Ukraine, still insufficient is situation with the rule of law and operation of law enforcement institutions and judiciary system, as reforms in these areas were either failed or even just fake reforms. Still, inefficient economic and social policy models is also a big challenge. Over the whole period of Ukraine's independence, political system has demonstrated an ability to offer efficient economic and social policies. Finally, the protracted war with Russia becomes an unfavorable framework for democratic transition and can even lead to some democratic backsliding.